بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم اللهم أعلمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Today, inshallah, we will talk about two of Allah's names, Al-Qawwy and Al-Mateen. The author, Sheikh Abdul Razak Al-Badr, Hafidahullah, he puts them together in the same chapter because they both have to do with strength. Al-Qawwy is a little bit more general in meaning than Al-Mateen. Al-Mateen has implications of intensity that are explicitly communicated rather than simply implied in the name Al-Qawwy. So Al-Qawwy, the general meaning is that Allah is the strongest, that Allah has perfect strength. Recall the principles that we had talked about in the beginning of this class that Sheikh Abdul Razak mentions in his introduction to the book. He said all of Allah's names, first of all, they point to an attribute or a characteristic. Those attributes and characteristics, they can be essential to Allah, or they can deal with parts of Allah's activity, or they can talk about both. So one of the examples by which this becomes clear, for example, Allah is Al-Ahad, the unique. This is an essential attribute. How can we tell? Because it's not possible to separate or stop or pause this particular quality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is inseparable from His essence. Right? So this is one of Allah's attributes of essence. Whereas something such as Al-Qabid, Al-Basit, the one who restricts, the one who extends or gives or grants, they are tied to Allah's activity. And so Allah does them when and as He wills. And there are some that exist in both categories, such as, for example, the fact that Allah speaks. Allah, we know, speaks. His ability to speak, His capacity to speak, is something that's essential to Him. It's not possible to separate it out from who Allah is. And yet the instances of Him speaking happen in real time at particular moments. Sometimes Allah chooses to speak and sometimes He doesn't. Right? So along these kinds of categories, and they're simply lenses to get us to understand deeper the contours of these meanings and the attributes that they represent. Both Al-Qawwy and Al-Mateen, do you think that, I'll ask you the question, are they names that represent attributes that are part of Allah's essence, or they reflect activities of Allah, or both? What do you think? Okay. I was concerned for a second there, Brother Muhammad. Usually when you ask a yes or no question or an either or question, someone says yes, they're messing with you. No, mashallah. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely, we're certain that it has to do with his essence. Okay. And then I can also see an argument for somebody that wants to say that that it's both essence and activity. Right. Depends on specific circumstance. So there's no doubt that strength is an essential quality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we think about it in terms of activities that demonstrate his strength, then those are things that happen in real time. Allah chooses to do them when and however he wills. So at least we can say, at least it's certainly an essential quality, and it might also be um, part of Allah's activity. What do we mean when we talk about Allah's strength? I'll turn it over to you again, because let's admit, with even in the way that we use this adjective strength or strong, strength, the noun, there's different types of strength. We say someone has to be strong when they have to bear something, whether it's internal, emotionally, or it's external, physically. MashaAllah, yes, salam. That's a lovely analogy. So, what are the ways in which Allah is strong? What do we mean when we say Allah is strong? We can't have a literal definition, because if we say that he can lift heavy things, there could be a way in which that's true, and a way in which that might be getting a little too close to making a likeness between Allah and human beings, depending on our intention or our phraseology. So what do we mean? What are types of Allah's strength? Or how does he demonstrate his strength? Okay, mashallah. So we have one answer says, in knowledge, the seen and unseen. That's one thing. Okay, so knowledge is power. That's a very popular thing that we were told in school in the States. Knowledge is power. And so because he knows the most, he is the most powerful. And then I really like the second part where you said to say be and it is. Okay. So the ability to implement and apply, the ability to realize your will without any sort of obstruction, interference, preventative power, that is a form of strength. Yes. He does not need anyone. Strength is being one. Good. MashaAllah. So there's an element of independence with strength, right? We say this in our everyday culture all the time, these twin ideas of strength and independence. He's a strong, independent person. She's a strong, independent person. La hawla wa la quwwata is that is the attribute, right? Yes, quwwa. Yes, with a ta marbuta at the end. So if you're going to pronounce the whole word, la quwwata, quwwa is from Qawwy. You're right. So Allah is Al-Qawwy, and the attribute is Al-Qawwa. So he has strength. Ya salam. So now we have the ability to create as well. Well done. Not the artist who takes materials and makes something beautiful, but rather creates everything and gives the sight to enjoy the beauty that is created. Ya salam. Ya salam. Anything we achieve is because of his strength. Yes, definitely. If Allah's strength is present in his ability to realize and actualize his will, consider that part of his will is your rizq, right? Whether it is your money or your talents or anything else. So we have something such as his strength that's coming in and coloring, inflecting his other attributes. His rizq and strength manifest in very, very similar, if not identical, instances where he is bestowing. Because someone could be a raziq in the sense that they provide, but it could be a struggle for that person. Every head of the household wakes themselves up early in the morning, shakes the sleep out of their eyes, splashes some cold water on their face, goes to work, is patient in the commute, maybe gets yelled at by their boss, maybe has to do back-breaking labor. This is how we, as human beings, get rizq, or we should say, take the means to secure Allah's rizq, or how provision happens, the means that Allah created for them. The man gets his paycheck at the end of the week, or the end of the month, or the woman gets her paycheck, and they have provided for their family. But think about all of the struggle and toil and obstacles that were in the way. And so Allah isn't merely the provider, but He's also Al-Qawwy, which means that His provision, there is no obstacle, there is no barrier, there is no force that can repel or slow down or make difficult or make strenuous or arduous that process of giving sustenance. Ay, ya salam. Oh man, the Shahada family is on a roll tonight, mashallah. People give and it takes away from their portion, whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives and needs nothing. Ya salam. MashaAllah. Yes, all of these things. So what I have written down, and it's very much, he can defend the wronged. His adl, his qist, his justice. Allah's al-Qahhar, the overcomer, al-Jabbar, the compeller. Right? Al-Mutakabbir, the glorious. Very good. In Allah's ability to take the oppressor to task. Natural disasters, also very good. Yes. Who can move? If human beings had the ability to cause a tsunami or an earthquake whenever they wanted to fight against their enemy, they would have done it. Of course they would do it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to cause these things very, very easily. The orchestration of, we could go planetary as well, right? Meteors, the orbit of everything, how stars are born and then they die in this spectacular display of a supernova, right? The black hole, all of these sorts of things that are now in our awareness that necessarily weren't in people's awareness the same way 1,000 years ago. More and more demonstrations of Allah's strength. Ya salam. I was going to come to Musa, mashallah. Beat me to it. Parting of the sea and making it dry. Aywa. Allah says in the Quran, He made it dry. How can you take a piece of ground that's been under the water for millennia, perhaps, and not only did Allah cause the sea to part, but made it dry in an instant for Musa alayhi salam and his followers to cross. Excellent. All excellent examples. Hey. Using current events, we have a virus you cannot see. I said we can't use that example? Oh, no, 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 no. That is a good example about lifting. I was simply saying, I didn't mean to come across as saying you can't use it, because of course Allah is able to lift something. There's no doubt about that. But what I was trying to contrast it with was a particular mechanistic understanding of how things are lifted when they're talked about as humans, right? So when we're talking about things as humans, I have to lift the lid, right? I have to exert pressure with something material that belongs to me, such as my organ or my muscle or something. Perform work. That work is fatiguing. It has to be in the direction that I want it to create this lifting in the world, right? So all I was trying to say, and I wanted to get to other types of strength that you mentioned, so I wanted to pass over it, was that if we're going to use, the lifting example, then we just have to be certain that we free, or we give due right to Allah in not making him seem like he's dependent on the same materialistic means that we are. Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees, but he doesn't require light and something to have a pigment and the light to reflect off of that thing in order for him to see. Because once we get into the materialistic mechanisms by which we experience those capacities, then we get into limitation, right? We can only, if color, there are certain colors we can't see. If light, for example, if we say that vision is dependent upon light, light is a wave, okay? There's certain frequencies of waves that we can see and certain frequencies of waves that we can't see. We can't see ultraviolet light. There are animals such as, I believe bees and other animals can see ultraviolet light, right? We don't even know what that means. You can imagine, what does it even mean to see ultraviolet light? I have no idea, right? So when we enter into the kayf, the how, then we run up against the limitation. So there's nothing wrong with saying Allah lifts. Of course Allah lifts. Allah lifts Jabal Tur, exactly like you said. But we have to be sure that people understand that if we're going to use the lifting example, that we it's not occurring through a physical medium such as when we do it, and so therefore it's not subject to any limitations as when we do it. And really, I just wanted to get away from lifting just because there's many different types of strength, and lifting is the easy one that comes to our minds, but it's definitely a legitimate example. And as the Shahada family said, the virus, excellent. You can't even see it, but it's killing humans of all walks of life, despite the technology, despite the tafakhur, the boastful pride that we have in our, mashallah, we're in the developed West, the advanced world, and we can go to the moon and go to Mars, and we can freeze people's bodies and maybe revive them at a later date, and all of these conceits that we have about our ability. And Allah has brought the world to its knees with something that is microscopic. SubhanAllah. Yes. And I mean, while we're talking about it, and Allah knows best as to all of these things, but it is remarkable to me that the nations that are the most profoundly affected by it seem to be the quote unquote, it's a problematic term, but the quote unquote first world nations. Not that it hasn't been bad in other places, but it tends to affect populations that are older, which happen to also be in the first world. So you have, yes, the nations that pride themselves on life expectancy. One of the very, very common criteria by which standard of living is judged, quality of life, I believe the UN calls it, right? And nations have been feeling pretty happy about themselves for quite a while due to their life expectancy, and all of a sudden they're brought to their knees by this virus. Subhanallah. Subhanallah. So this is a wonderful conversation. If I look at my notes, what I came up with, it's mostly what everybody already said. So there's a negative way in which we can look at Allah's strength, and that is to say that there's nothing He can't do. Okay, like He's capable of everything, or not incapable of anything, right? And there are many manifestations of this, such as Allah's ability to create, as we said, to split, right? To split the grain seed, right, and to cause it to grow. This is a type of strength. To wither and weather things like mountains, right? To cause meteors or comets to come hurtling across the cosmos and take out a planet, put it on a whole new course, maybe kill all the living creatures on it. These sorts of things, right? The ability to resurrect, okay? This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran, where people are doubting the resurrection. Allah is saying, I've created you in the first instance, which was a much more difficult, and nothing is difficult for Allah, but He's saying it's much more impressive, let's say. It's much more impressive to have created you in the first instance. Do you really think it's any more difficult to join you back together, to regather the cells and the atoms that used to make up your body? No, not at all. It's easier. Right? So His ability to resurrect, His ability to exact justice, right? This is something that's just common sense. I always bring back the example of, let's say there's a little kid and there's a grown adult, and the grown adult, maybe steps on the little kid's toe. And the little kid kind of threatens the adult and says, oh, you should be thankful that I'm going to let you off the hook this time, because next time you're not going to be so fortunate. We would laugh. It would be funny to us. Why would it be funny to us? Because the little kid doesn't have quwwah. He doesn't have power. And so because he doesn't have power, he's not able to implement justice, right? Or take to task, or to return, right, actions that have been done to him. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Qawwy. He is the strongest, and He's able to return actions. I'll get back to that thought in a second. That reminds me of something else. He's able to bring to justice, right? He brings the most severe taghut, such as Fir'aun and the likes of him, to justice. Abu Jahl and the other Quraysh chiefs, and He does it through an extremely elaborate plan. This is all part of Allah's strength, Al-Qawwy. And I had forgotten the other aside I was going to go on. Oh, that's right. There are other things that Allah does in the Quran with verbs, okay, with verbs that don't make it into His names or even His attributes. Like, for example, Allah in Surah Al-Baqarah, He says, يَسْتَهْزِئُ بِهِمْ Allah يَسْتَهْزِئُ بِهِمْ. Right? When Allah is talking about the hypocrites, how they mock Allah, Allah mocks them back, right? Does that make Allah al-mustahzi? Does that make Allah the mocker, the one who mocks? No, it doesn't. Which is why, on principle, we can't automatically derive one of Allah's names from a verb in the Quran. But why does Allah mock them? Because it's retaliation. It's a return. It's responding in kind. And to not be able to respond in kind is a type of weakness, right? So Allah is able to respond in kind, and that is part of His strength, right? He's able to dish it out, just as other people try to, even though they don't harm Allah, they attempt to. And so Allah is able to turn it right back around and do the same thing to them and actually have it cause an effect. And we also mentioned implementation, right? His perfect ability to implement. That is part of his strength. If someone is not able to achieve what they want, even if someone struggles hard to achieve what they want, then their strength is not total. It's not complete strength. It's qualified strength. There are other strengths out there that were a net drag, if you will, a hindrance to achieving what that person wanted. And so that person's strength is not absolute. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has absolute strength. There's no degree of resistance. Going to the comments, we have part of strength is also having the ability not to do too much or too little, but having the perfect balance of that strength. Something like finesse. And, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Shahada family, because one thing that we mentioned in the beginning of class is that many names inflect others, right? So just like we talked about how we could imagine that there's such a thing as a provider that doesn't have strength or perfect strength or absolute strength. But because Allah is the provider and has absolute strength, each of them complement each other, right? Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the strongest, but He's also Al-Hakim. He's also the most wise. He's also the Rahman. He's also Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. And so these names inflect Allah's strength so that it doesn't become some sort of buffoonish misapplication of force. There are plenty of strong people in the world that their strength is actually used for oppression, or is used in a way that it doesn't affect the desired outcome. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His strength is always perfectly applied in the perfect degree and in the perfect manner and in the perfect direction, informed by His wisdom and His mercy. Another comment says, what is scary is when we think about strength in dunyawi terms, we can see the building of that strength, whether it is manufacturing arms, bodybuilding, training in an army. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exacts His justice or punishment, there is no sign. There is no warning. He does not build strength or work to a position of strength. Yes, Salam. Yes, Salam. That's a lovely reflection. Because to have to build strength would imply a time in which there was not strength, right? This was another one of Sheikh Abdul Razak's principles in the introduction, that every name and every attribute that Allah has, it has three things that our attributes do not have. There was never a time when it didn't exist. Okay, so that attribute had no beginning because it's part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That attribute has no end because it's part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah has no end. And during that entire manifestation of that attribute, there is no deficiency or weakness in it. There's no ability to improve it, in maybe to use your analogy. And so therefore it is perfect and it is absolute. And that is a little bit scary, you're right, because if an army or if a nation is stockpiling weapons, right, purchasing F-15s or F-16s, fighter jets, amassing, nuclear arms. These are all things that nations and their intelligence agencies attempt to ascertain. They attempt to observe and keep track of everybody's capabilities. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no building of capability that needs to happen. It's if you want to use the analogy, the bullet's already in the chamber, it's already locked and loaded. There is, just as Brother Muhammad said, kun fayakun, merely the word, and with perfect speed and perfect implementation, it exists, which is something that we forget about. which is the scary part. MashaAllah. Very good. So we also mentioned, and this is something that everybody said, aywa, it makes people defiant almost. Which brings us back, masarrat, to the importance of dhikr, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can't be seen in the same way that everybody sends spies to take stock of the enemy's arsenal and weaponry and their stockpile, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a way, is out of sight and so out of mind for a lot of people. We forget, because we're so used to interacting with the dunyawi causes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, we become tricked into thinking that those are the only causes, that that's the real reality, when in fact that's all the contingent secondary reality to Allah's absolute necessary reality. And so dhikr is what breaks that. Dhikr is the thing that keeps your memory and your awareness and your consciousness on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his capabilities. Not only in the fearful way, like his capabilities that would make you, watch out, but also his capabilities of justice and mercy, so that you may have hope. And that's some of the other things that I had written down. So for example, to know and to remember with dhikr that no one can stop his will, that there is no opposing force to his control or power. These are things that should lead us to not despair and not regret, not despair on what has missed us, because Allah's will was done. There was no other force of evil, and we'll get to that in a second, or randomness that overcame Allah's will or turned something away from you. No, it was all Allah's will. And so if Allah willed things to be like this, and we know that he's the most merciful, and we know that he's the strongest, and we know that he is the wisest, then that requires us to submit to it, whether it's the thing that we wanted to have happen or not. Also looking towards the future, knowing that even the worst calamities that go on now, that Allah is Al-Qahhar, he is the overcomer, he's the compeller, he's the conqueror, all of these things, that Allah's will and justice will be done. It will happen. The rope that he gives to people is not to cause more harm, is not to necessarily let anyone get away with anything. That Allah has the perfect ability to implement and to take someone to task, to bring them to heel, hold them to account. And when Allah wills that to be done, it will happen instantaneously. And so we need not despair too excessively for the hardship and the oppression that occurs in our lives. The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no resistance is important to our conception of evil in Islam. This is one of the main dividing points between Islam and Christianity, either historically or originally. Christianity has tended over the centuries to conceptualize evil as a force that seems to at times overcome the ability of Allah. Whereas in Islam, we know that the devil has no actual power. He is not Al-Qawwy. He's not even Qawwy. He does not have power to overcome us. What it is the receptor sites in us if we haven't dulled them with dhikr and worship. We will want to follow the suggestion, and we will end up following, we will decide to follow the suggestion and thus commit wrong and sin and bring evil into the world. Yes. So, yes. So, what we're saying is that in Islam, evil is not a second God. Okay. Like some people imagine. Some people imagine good versus evil, God versus the devil, in this kind of struggle that puts them on an equal plane. To think that sometimes God overcomes the devil and sometimes the devil overcomes God and his will, or things like this. This breaks Tawheed, right? This elevates the shaitan, Iblis, and all of his army to the level of a God by imagining that this is what's going on. No. What really is the reality is that everything is under and submissive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his will, but he has willed these suggestions from the devil and the suggestions from your nafs and the receptor sites within your heart, if you have not trained your heart, are going to listen to those suggestions and decide to commit evil and bring about evil into the world. So this is not the overcoming of Allah's will. This is not a second God having his day and overcoming the first. This is something that is much more manageable. If you give evil too much credit, you actually end up, I don't want to say something as dramatic as something as shirk, but sometimes it could be, sometimes it might not be, but you give too much credit to evil and the devil to the point where you are giving it power that it doesn't have. Yes, Iblis, yes, the Iblis did ask permission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have free reign until the day of judgment. That's very true. And the devil actually said, I believe it's in Surah Al-Isra, though I could be incorrect, that he had no power. It's somewhere in there, 15, 16, 17. That he had no power over us. Rather, it was our choice to follow his command or his suggestion, really. If we know this, then we should not let ourselves get carried away with conspiracy talk, right? This is not befitting, in my opinion, the disposition of a Muslim when it comes to their sense of the role and power of evil and the role and power of Allah. Allah is Al-Qawwy, and evil, the devil, Iblis, is not Al-Qawwy. All of the forces of jinn and man, even if they are conspiring against Islam, even if they're conspiring against the Muslims, that stuff might be true. But to obsess to a certain point and to blame everything on these kind of elaborate conspiracies, as happens in the Muslim community, we have to be careful not to attribute to these evil actors more power than they actually have. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Qawwy, and he is able to achieve anything with no resistance, with no hesitation. And so if we are right with Allah and our faith is strong and we're doing what he wants and we take the means, then Allah will deliver us and cause us to, this gives us hope. Exactly. Because we don't, why is there hope in that? Because we're not responsible. Yes, first of all, excellent. Because it can feel when you read too much about the news and too much politics and too much conspiracy theory, it feels like the whole creation is against you and you feel like there's no way out. You start to minimize in your own perception the power and ability that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has. We're not responsible for knowing the how, always. We're responsible for the what, and Allah will take care of the how. What did the Muslims do at the Battle of the Trench? They had a plan, they dug the trench, Did they know how the enemy army was going to be defeated and scattered? No, they did not. But they were pious, they were righteous, they took the means that were available to them, and then Allah scattered them with a windstorm, caused dissension in their ranks. Allah holds their hearts in His hand, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so He's capable of doing any of that. And this happened time and time again. We could go through all the historical examples, but it would take us far, far over time. One last thought. Is that with all of what we know about Allah being Al-Qawwy, Al-Mateen, the infinitely, abundantly, absolutely strong, it throws into relief the folly, the pure folly of approaching anything other than Allah for our worship, for our reward, for our needs. We're not talking about asking for a cup of sugar. We're talking about for blessings, for ultimate success. Ya salam, inna Allah ar-Razaq dhu quwwatin mateen. Yes, mashallah. Ar-Razaq dhu quwwatin mateen. Mashallah. Very good. It's all put together. So if we know that Allah is Al-Qawwy, Al-Mateen, then our reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should increase. Our submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should increase, and our devotion should become even more exclusive. When you see the type of power that Allah has, the absolute power, and you see what pitiful, conditional, derivative power things like nations and governments and popular culture and all and whatever have, all of them, then you realize that what are we doing? Putting our faith, putting our expectations, putting our hopes, putting our fears into anything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we've gone over time, but that was fun. Anybody have any last remarks or questions before we dismiss for the night? Ya salam. Ya salam. Health alone, the complexity of a human body alone, and how it is perfectly balanced by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how the slightest thing is off, and no matter how, quote unquote, strong we are brought to our knees. That's a really nice last word. MashaAllah. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. I really enjoyed it tonight. And I will see you next time. Allahu ta'ala a'lam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ameen wa iyyakum.